Thank you, Jonathan. And I am very happy to be here. I'm hoping I'm going to be able to run my technology, so forgive me. I'm especially happy to be here, particularly after, or being paired with Jonathan Weinberg, and that's for a couple of reasons. Particularly after hearing his talk, I think you'll see how my paper sort of pings off of and sometimes interweaves a little bit with some of the issues he was discussing, and also much more concretely, I'll freely admit that this paper was sort of a sort of series of speculations. It's offered up as such, and when I was really trying to figure out how to bring a shape to it, it was actually going to Lost and Found, where I realized that sort of one way to approach it would be to imagine sort of what went into one single piece in that amazing sort of array of materials, and so it actually sort of the light bulb went off. So now, unlike Jonathan, I am going to read because winging has led to disaster in too many other arenas. So, all right, let's see. Nope. Now where am I? Here I am. Okay, so far so good. Okay. So my paper considers the status change that occurs when casual snapshots, family photographs, and other photographic images leave their original context and become historical evidence through their incorporation into an archive. This issue has particular urgency at the interface of historical research and queer history, fueled especially by numerous recently published queer photographic histories, like David Dieter's Dear Friends, and the vigorous growth of multiple GLBT archives, whose largest holdings and collection priorities often center on historic photographic documents. An archive's historical authority and its utility depend on the transparent visibility of the evidence it contains, while queer identity in the past often depended on the ability to remain invisible in the face of social, legal, and medical prohibition. So using as its touchstone a photograph now housed in the Paris Opera Library, my paper considers several intertwined questions. How does this particular image provide or withhold evidence of its maker's same-sex relationship? So what are the implications that this evidence was lost temporarily within the opera's archive? And more broadly, what happens when casual photographs become part of official history? How cautious should we be about photographs as historical evidence of queer identity and desire? And what methodological issues arise when archives forced visibility and queer histories, between archives forced visibility and queer histories studied in visibility? And so while my primary focus today is narrow, it's actually on a single image, my thoughts are necessarily inflected and shaped by circumstances particular to this moment, events surrounding hide and seek. And these in turn are linked to my own past work. So I do want to provide some broader context that will, I hope, amplify and support the issues and questions I'll address through this photograph. So as you heard, in 2000, I curated the exhibition Amazons in the Drawing Room, The Art of Romaine Brooks for the National Museum of Women in the Arts here in Washington, D.C., just down the street. This is an installation view from the entrance of the show. At the time, the exhibition represented a fairly significant shift in the museum's institutional practice in two ways. It was the first solo retrospective by an acknowledged lesbian artist, and it was the first exhibition framed partly by issues of queer sexuality. As a guest curator, I worked closely and cooperatively with the museum's in-house curatorial department, including the chief curator and now director, Susan Fisher-Sterling. And on the surface, there are very few expressions of institutional concern or risk. But in retrospect, there were a few signs. For example, when the assistant curator dutifully relayed a question from very high above, asking whether I had to use the word lesbian in the exhibition's introductory text. My answer was yes. And very much to their credit, the curatorial staff never asked this or similar questions again. And although it was the museum's main exhibition when it opened, Amazons in the Drawing Room had no public opening. I was sure this was a pretty significant break from recent precedent as a member of the museum, and it was chalked up to budgetary issues, which may very well have been true given the challenge of fundraising support for queer-themed shows, particularly 10 years ago. Nevertheless, the opening gala consisted of me and the curatorial staff going out for Indian dinner on open night to celebrate. So given the occasional institutional angst and the very quiet opening, I was pleased by the amount of public attention the show generated, including a Washington Post feature article and a positive review in which Brooks's sexual identity and the exhibition's exploration of that featured prominently. This is a detailed view of the show, and I've chosen this one because it's the portion of the show that thematically comes sort of closest to considering the impact of Brooks's personal relationships. This is sort of framed around her relationship with the dancer Ida Rubinstein, and that'll be significant later in the talk. Soon after that, a noted author and former Washington Post writer submitted a letter to the editor responding to that initial positive review. The author criticized my focus on Brooks's lesbian sexuality, suggesting that the artist would have considered it, quote, an insult to connect gender and sexuality identity to the work, even in the case of portraiture. That as a painter, Brooks, quote, considered herself sexless. And finally, that Brooks may be judged on other qualities, but, quote, please don't judge her by the sex of the people she has sex with, end quote. This prompted Post reviewer Michael L. Sullivan to respond directly to that letter with another exhibition review. He was not the original reviewer, in which he considered the relevance of an artist's gender and sexuality as informative of an artwork's meaning, asking, quote, does any of this change the way we look at the pictures? Well, in some ways, how can it not? During his subsequent analysis, he stops just short of saying that protestations such as the one he was addressing were a willful sort of recloseting, despite the fact that Brooks's sexuality was hardly a revelation of the exhibition itself. So looking back now at these two responses to the show and on this debate that erupted ever so briefly into the Washington, D.C. public sphere, I'm struck by two things. First, the letter to the editor frames its critique in terms precisely relevant to the early 20th century historical moment in which Brooks worked, arguing correctly that female artists could scarcely afford to have the fact that they were women, much less not strictly heterosexual women, brought to bear on the professional evaluation or the interpretation of their work. Second, in its defense of my curatorial viewpoint and the relevance of this methodological approach, O'Sullivan his review rightly points to a disparity between the directness with which I addressed Brooks's sexual orientation in the catalog and some reticence to do so in the exhibition text itself. After citing a few examples from label text, including one in which I characterized Brooks and writer Natalie Barney's 50-year relationship as, quote, a personal and professional collaboration, he asks, what, did they open a bakery together? So maybe I internalized the Women's Museum's cautionary questions more than I remember or more than I would care to admit. Given my own past curatorial efforts, the attention they brought to Brooks's work, and the methodological and historical issues raised, I'm thrilled that Brooks's work is featuring prominently in a beautifully crafted and high-profile exhibition thematically dedicated to exploring negotiations of queer identity and portraiture, this time contextualized in a broader scope of American art and history, and even in the same building, if not the same institution, that has housed a sizable portion of her life's work for the last 40 years. And yet, a decade later, here we are again. Debates have erupted about the value and the appropriateness of an exhibition that explores connections between sex and gender identity and artistic output. Arguments that turn precisely on the same issues of what we can and should be looking for and looking at in relation to queer identities. Only this time, debate has spurred action, denouncements and defenses have been full-throated and sustained, and the potential consequences significant and long-lasting. It's this present context of seeking and hiding, seeing and suppressing, that urges me to reflect on my own past experiences and to return to a very small corner of my previous research, in an effort to explore these dynamics again of queer visibility, history, and institutions. And so what follows is a kind of theoretical thought experiment, and I hope is understood in that spirit. And it's one that helps me to address the complex politics of visibility that attends queer historical scholarship. And so to the picture. On the very last day of a research grant I had in Paris in the late 1990s, I went to the archives of the Musée de l'Opéra to look through their collection of material on the early 20th century Russian dancer Ida Rubinstein. From the catalog I'd seen in advance, I didn't expect to find much, and I was, frankly, covering my bases. I was in Paris researching Romaine Brooks, with whom Rubinstein had a personal relationship between 1911 and 1913, when Rubinstein was at the height of her fame as a member of the prestigious Ballet Russe and publicly romantically linked with the male Italian poet Gabriele D'Annunzio. So the materials arrived, and among the fairly mundane performance photos and a few candid pictures, I found this. Labeled Ida Rubinstein, Bois de Boulogne, and attributed to Anonyme or Anonymous, I knew immediately that Brooks was the image's maker. The photograph closely resembles a contemporary painting Brooks made of Rubinstein, for which this may have been a sort of preparatory study. The archive, though, had no information regarding the picture's provenance or how it may have ended up in the opera's collection. So I asked for a reproduction. I came home to the US and thought idly about whether I should identify it for the Musée once I had firmed up the connection. When the reproduction arrived a few weeks later, though, I looked at the photograph more closely and I discovered something interesting. The shadow of the photographer is actually inside the photographic frame. So I think you can see it, but I'm going to walk over here and show you. This is actually the elbow and the shoulder of the photographer. So it was then that I realized that this unexpected photograph from the archives was not only by Brooks, but related to a larger series that I had previously studied. It's important to note that Brooks's public image as an artist centered exclusively on painting, so these were never publicly exhibited, nor was photography really a significant professional interest in her career. Therefore, these photographs situated in Brooks's studio are rightly considered private, both in process and content. I've argued elsewhere that these pictures are a complex exploration of lesbian identity and same-sex desire in 20th century France, and a negotiation of Brooks's identity as a female artist. In the series, she is especially concerned with the possibilities and risks of newly coalescing visual codes of same-sex eroticism and identification in relation to both her involvement with Rubinstein and as mediated through her painting of the female nude. There are at least 25 images in this series, and the connection between the one in the archive and these, you'll notice that Ida Rubinstein is wearing the same sort of star headdress in both sets of pictures. But I'll focus just briefly on this one. So in this picture, Brooks establishes the visual field through the bifurcated space of the mirror that bisects the picture. And so what you see is two views of her studio space. And on the left-hand side, sort of down the side in the background, is one painting in progress called Spring. And then over her shoulder, reflected in the mirror, is in progress this painting, Le Trajet, or The Crossing. And you can actually see what she's doing is beginning to paint the black ground in the painting. So that kind of, one of the things that this photograph kind of, when I saw it and realized what it was, made me realize that these two paintings, even though they had actually never been exhibited together and in fact spent most of their life half a world away from one another, were in fact originally intended as kind of visual and thematic pendants to one another. And you can actually still see the original green ground on the painting on the right when you see it in person. So the visual tension here is created by the clarity and concreteness of the image, which is suggested by the mirror, and the ineffable nature of the women's bodies. They're clearly visible, but they're actually uncannily somewhere else. None are actually in front of the camera or inside the picture. Ida Rubinstein is actually only present through the two paintings, and Romaine Brooks is only present in the reflection in the mirror. And so the photograph gives the impression of Brooks's interest in the possibilities photography may offer in visualizing her relationship and her desire, as well as her caution or perhaps even doubt or suspicion at the same time. Of course, all of this is historically grounded. Brooks made these images just as lesbian sexuality was surfacing within the European cultural imagination, and like male homosexuality before it, in the context of its criminalization and censure. Sexologists, psychologists, and lawmakers were busily marking and interpreting this newly visible identity. So the risks of being visible were considerable for these women, particularly since Rubinstein was a public figure whose success depended on her erotic appeal. So Brooks's photograph seems to be meditating on the benefits and costs of cultural visibility and a strategic invisibility. To put it another way, the power of the unseen community lies in its ability to cohere outside the system of observation that seeks to patrol it. So the in-jokes, the secret codes, the iconography of dress, movement, and speech, which can be read by those within the community but escape the interpretive power of those external to it, can create another expressive language that, as performance theorist Peggy Phelan notes, quote, cannot be translated by those who are not familiar with the meanings of this intimate tongue, end quote. Or she continues, the risk of visibility then is the risk of any translation, a weaker version of the original script, the appropriation by powerful others. The payoff of visibility and translation is more people will begin to speak in your tongue. This was the conundrum then that Brooks, her lover, their friends, and others all faced. Visibility brought down the power of science and the law, but also made them culturally legible to one another, a first step towards community, and began to establish the realities of this identity in the wider culture. With this work, Brooks thinks specifically about photography as an evidentiary medium. The analogy of camera and mirror makes this clear. And indeed, photography had been firmly established as a tool in the service of observation, documentation, and pathology of cultural difference. By the end of the 19th century, this included everything from photography's growing use as a diagnostic tool, recording outward signs of mental and physical disturbance, to the mugshots used to fix the features of suspected lawbreakers and criminals. In this context, considering where this photograph ended up prompts a larger question. What happens where photography meets the archive? Photography's clarity, its ability to mirror reality, makes it appear the ideal visual medium of the archival system and its mechanisms of recording and ordering, its impulse to generate cultural knowledge. Michel Foucault pursues the relationship between archives and cultural power in his work, The Archaeology of Knowledge, in terms that are relevant for the discussion here. Foucault describes the archive as, quote, the system that establishes statements as events and as things. This shift in the order of knowledge seems to me analogous to the movement of the photographic snapshot when it enters the archive, a movement from a casual statement to an official record. It's seen preserved as an event worthy of historical study and analysis. Interestingly, in following this line of thought, Foucault uses visual metaphors to explain the operation of the archive in this production of cultural knowledge. He says the archive restores, quote, as if by magic, what is lacking in every gaze. And he elsewhere describes the archive as, quote, a reflection that shows us quite simply and in shadow what all those in the foreground are looking at. Foucault's emphasis here is on the archive's restoration of historical clarity, but significantly the phrase, and in shadow, suggests some ambiguity or perhaps doubt in the very center of the archive's operation or about the archive's efficacy. In a single sentence, Foucault moves from the reassuring clarity of the mirror's reflection to the dubious ephemerality of shadows. For me, an irresistible parallel to Brooks's use of mirrors and shadows in a single session photographing herself and her lover. So it turns out that there's more at stake than the seemingly straightforward issue of identifying Brooks as the author of the photograph in the Musée de l'Opéra. My first impulse was to identify the picture for the Musée to make Romaine Brooks an agent of history. Also to, in some very small way, officially install just a little bit more queerness in the opera's archive. And what's at stake turns precisely again on the tension between visibility and strategic invisibility. More specifically this time as related to Foucault's ongoing concern to interrogate systems of power. On the one hand, the archive is a state-sanctioned ordering of knowledge. This is literally true for the Opéra, and therefore approximate to the medical and juridical visibility and pathologizing historically experienced by Brooks and by others. Female homosexuality and same-sex desire increasingly figured as matters of national health and security in France during World War I. On the other hand, though, the archive offers concrete evidence of socially erased identities. Just as photography captures and fixes a visual image, all archival evidence provides proof over and against cultural attempts at suppression and willful forgetting. So does the shadow or Brooks's shadow suggest presence or absence, the possible or the impossible? These questions and this decision force me to consider my own place in the archival system. Or to put it more plainly, is this issue about these women or is it about me? The historian's role in regard to archival research is obviously an enormous topic, and I can't really rehearse all those in detail today. We do have 10 other speakers. I'll note, though, that many recent accounts of the historian's investment in archival knowledge have been shaped by Jacques Derrida's 1994 text, Archive Fever. The original title in French is Mal d'Archive, which also translates as archive sickness. Derrida's essay prompts urgent questions about the way in which we generate historical narratives from our own conscious and unconscious desires, effectively transforming the archive from a collection of knowledge to a place of, quote, longing and appropriation. Historian Carolyn Steedman uses that phrase in her study of archives and cultural history entitled Dust. She notes that in this affective historical mode, quote, the past is searched for something that confirms the searcher in his or her sense of self, confirms them as they want to be and feel in some measure that they already are. It seems we do this quite obdurately in the face of the hard and clear advice from psychoanalysis, which tells us that this quest is impossible, that what we are searching for is a lost object which really cannot be found. The object, event, happening, story from the past has been altered by the very search for it, by its time and duration, end quote. These ideas have particular resonance for queer history. The idea that queer sexualities, bodies, and cultures have been hidden from history, which is the title of an important early collection of queer historiography and methodology, suggests that the historian's project is one of recuperation and redress. And I'm not at all suggesting this isn't a necessary or viable process, or at all an impossible goal. In fact, Steedman uses her provocative metaphor of dust to refer to the impossibility of things disappearing completely from history. Matter is never truly eradicated, even by purposeful or violent destruction. It's only transformed. On the other hand, the recuperative imperative that informed some early queer history occasionally carries an assumption that this historic erasure can and should be replaced by visibility. Steedman cautions us to be especially attentive to that move. The archive, she writes, is the kind of place to do with wanting things that are put together, collected, collated, named in lists and indices, a place where a whole world, a social order, may be imagined by the recurrence of a name in a register through a scrap of paper or some other little piece of flotsam, end quote. I have some ambivalence about this sense of archival desire, even as I experience it. This recreation of a whole world from the bare dust of history can be both good and bad. It holds out the possibility for understanding both desire and its history. At the same time, it also recalls a kind of overdetermination or objectification that, despite radically different intentions, reminds me uncomfortably of the ways that science and the law obsessively scrutinized images, bodies, and spaces for evidence of deviance from its slightest sign, the very thing that these women, for instance, sought to avoid. Or, as Peggy Phelan bluntly warns, visibility inspires surveillance and submits to the gaze of panoptic authority. So, is it possible to resolve these dilemmas of the queer historian and queer artifacts? Art historian Gavin Butt recently explored the idea of gossip as a productive method for subcultural exchange and production. Although the specific focus of his study is quite different, it's the mid-20th century New York art world around Andy Warhol. In his introduction, he wonders briefly about gossip as an alternative methodology for queering history and the function of the archive. He writes, gossip is invariably unrecorded as a cultural document, and it is preserved instead within a chain of individual speech acts in the telling and retelling of certain stories as they urgently are swapped one to another. But this mode of information preservation is one that departs sharply from archival protocols. That is, it's a way that ensures knowledge's transmission and exchange, but that also largely avoids the clarity, fixity, and the control of archival order. But continues. As one gossips, one therefore participates in a viral economy of communication, proliferating information while keeping authoritative truth forever stalled by means of the various mutations of narrative content and emphasis. Gossip's information economy is therefore unlike the disembodied text-based episteme of the archive because it relies on an expressly performed body-to-body transmission, end quote. It's that last phrase, body-to-body transmission, that returns us finally to where we started, Romaine Brooks's photograph of her lover, Ida Rubinstein. Butt's richly suggestive metaphor raises the possibilities of knowledge created through an economy of desire rather than an archival economy of ordering, placement, and legibility. Brooks's photograph records but does not ultimately contain or confirm her and Rubinstein's exchanges. In doing this, Brooks explores the possibilities and the limits of same-sex desire in relationships at a cultural moment predicated on surveillance and prohibition. Her body's shadow is both present and literally intangible, hovering at the margins of the visual field, yet stubbornly refusing to submit to full visibility. So this vaporous illusion of light, that which structures the image's meaning, actually lies perpetually and irrevocably outside the photograph's frame and beyond the camera's reach. And these two women are joined insistently, if ineffably, through the body's shadow entwined in the folds of her lover's cloak. And to sort of twist the metaphor one more time, I can't help but point out that the archive placed its stamp directly over the shadow. So perhaps it's best to consider my presentation today as gossip, something that we know but that the Opera Archive doesn't. Knowledge that originates with the archive but isn't contained by it. Knowledge that remains anonymous. Maybe it's my own archival sickness that I've become so preoccupied with such a microscopic decision, this mote of historic dust. And maybe it's a symptom of my own archive fever that I've written that letter to the Musée, but I haven't sent it yet. Thank you.